Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining Reimagining High School, the role for state leadership, our webinar for today. I see many people joining us, but I'm going to give it another minute or so before we get started. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us. You're gonna be blown away by this amazing conversation, the amazing panelists we have, and this ever so important topic. All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? My name is Paulo Di Maria. I'm the president and CEO of the National Association of State Boards of Education. And today's webinar is called Reimagining High Schools, the Role for State Leadership. Many of you who know me know this is a topic of great passion for me. I'm a big advocate for making the high school experience the absolute best opportunity it can be to prepare students for whatever their experience is going to be after their high school experience, whether it's college, whether it's heading right into a career, whether it's going into the military, whether it's pursuing some other mission or passion, starting a business, entrepreneurship, what have you. How can we make sure that they are prepared so that they have a successful life beyond high school? And a lot of that relies on that high school experience being an exceptional opportunity to build their knowledge and skills in so very, very, very many ways. Let's go to the next slide, Renee. Just by way of housekeeping, please keep any devices that you have in silence mode. This webinar is in fact being recorded, and we will share it with people. The recording and make that available to you, as well as any materials that end up getting posted as part of the chat. We have enabled closed captioning for those of you who value that particular feature. We are also, as I said, we will distribute the slides that are used today, as well as the recording for your edification. We also know that if you have questions and comments following this, we are a source of information, so feel free to contact us about following up with you on any of the issues that you hear talked about today. Please use the Q&A box, You'll see that in most cases at the bottom of your screen. If you're using a mobile phone, it may be in a different location, to submit your questions at any time. Some of those questions may be answered via the text feature, the response feature. Some may be answered in the course of the discussion itself. You're also free to post things in the chat, if I understand that correctly. Renee will correct me if I'm wrong. That is a place where we'll also be watching for any comments that people might have. Renee, go ahead and take us to the next slide. One of the things that I'm really proud about is that we at the National Association of State Boards of Education really recently issued our latest edition of the journal that you see pictured here, the State Education Standard. And we featured this very topic, high schools that matter, because we are a member-oriented organization, and our members are telling us that this is an issue of great importance to them, because they look around them, and as they work to create excellent education systems in the states in which they are state board members, they see the successes that they might be having in certain places, but we also see opportunities for improvement. And the high school arena is one of those places where we feel like, and our members feel like, that there are students who could have a much more relevant, much more engaging, much more career-focused, much more productive experience. And yet we are sometimes perplexed with how exactly do we do that? And that's what this panel is really going to try to tackle up front. Because we believe that not only state board members, but many of you who are not state board members but are still joining this webinar can be champions for this cause if you understand what it looks like and what are some of the things that are necessary precursors to making it happen. Let's go to the next slide. I have this little informal checklist in my head about the conditions that are right for high school redesign. First and foremost is creating the policy context and making sure that the policies in the state are conducive to the kind of redesigns that we might envision. And what I've discovered in my experience is that, in fact, many states already have that policy context, but many people either aren't aware of it or they're not willing to really make the leap and use some of them, whether that's, designing courses that integrate, science and mathematics, or that bring in work-based learning opportunities, or that allow for credit for, other experiences that a student might have. And then it's important that leadership is involved. To be successful in high school redesign, you have to build buy-in from the community and involve people in the co-design so that they're invested in the changes that are happening. especially among your faculty and staff. You have to rethink the use of time and space where learning takes place and the durations of that kind of learning. You really have to focus on curriculum and instructional practices and be innovative in that regard. You need to be supportive with students and be particularly focused on building those relationships between adults and students, and frankly, also between students in a peer-to-peer setting, and then leverage the heck out of partnerships with the business community, with social services, with healthcare organizations, with others who come to the table with an interest in helping students not only succeed in their academic pursuits, but also succeed in life. So with that, what we're going to start with, and this is the reason I love today's webinar, is we're going to actually start with a real life story of a wonderful high school. And so I am so pleased. Go ahead, Renee, take me to the next slide. I do want to highlight the fact that NASB's also published just recently this document about state sketches of a portrait of a graduate. One of the things that we found as a precursor to improving and going down the path of high school design is having really rich state level conversations, although sometimes it happens at the district level, about what do we want our graduates to be equipped with? What is that portrait of a graduate? Because that forms the foundation and informs the planning and the design work that goes into designing a new approach to high school that may not be the high school that many of us are used to or have attended. All right, let's go to the next slide. Keep me honest here. Very good. Now I'm ready to make the transition. Scott Best is an amazing member of the Indiana State Board of Education, and he is also the founder of Purdue Polytechnic High School. And he's going to tell us the story about Purdue Polytechnic High School. He himself is a graduate of Purdue and has a long history in business, as well as with organizations that work on workforce development, like Goodwill Industries and so forth and so on. And he took this on as an amazing challenge to say, you know what? We can create a better experience for our young people to lead them to success and to make that transition into whatever their calling is after high school. Scott, I'm going to turn it over to you. Tell us your great story.
Awesome, Paulo. Thank you so much. We're going to talk a little bit, just a case study of Purdue Polytechnic, kind of the journey we've been on and some of the why behind it. So go to the next slide. So the main thing here is the current system of instruction that we're using in high school throughout this country is designed perfectly to get the outcomes that we've been getting. So whether it's test scores, graduation rates, college completions, and those outcomes also include these significant gaps in achievement between different groups, right? So whether it's white students to black students, white students to Hispanic students, free and reduced lunch, take your pick of the category. We have these significant gaps in achievement across the country. And the way we do instruction today, the system's working exactly as designed. In fact, what we do today was largely recommended by the Committee of 10 back in 1892. And I'll show you something in a minute that shows that. The reason Purdue University wanted to get into the high school business was that their undergraduate enrollment is just 2% black students, right? 2%. The black population in Indiana is 10%. And if you look at the 18 and under group, it's higher than that. And so what Purdue realized was they had a disproportionate number of black students enrolled. And the same holds true, by the way, for Hispanic students, more than one race students. It goes across the board. And as a land grant university, they realized we can't, Mitch Daniels, the former governor of Indiana and then the president of Purdue up until last January, had a famous quote where he said, if we wait on the K through 12 system to solve this problem, we'll wait forever. And so Purdue said, we're going to jump into that. The big factor in Indiana, there's the largest school district in Indiana is Indianapolis Public Schools. They graduate roughly 1,000 students of color every year. They were only sending, depending on the year, 3 to 8 students of color onto Purdue each year, right? So when you do that math and you figure that out, that's such a tiny percentage. And in fact, in 2015, when Mitch really got the kind of the impetus to do this, there were only 258 Black and Hispanic students in the state of Indiana who met Purdue's average incoming SAT score. And so with that kind of pipeline, there's no wonder there's only 2%. Go ahead and go to the next slide. This is here just kind of for grins and giggles. If you look off to the table on the right, that is a report of the Committee of 10. And if you look at that, those recommended classes, maybe substitute French or Spanish or German for Latin, and that looks a lot like the typical high school schedule of today. Virtually no different. And then we wonder, why do high school students sometimes feel disconnected and, not feel like high school isn't relevant? Well, because it was designed in 1892. Go ahead, next slide. This gets to that, again, I'm on the case of, why redesign? Graduation rates vary by race. This is National Center for Education Statistics. This looks at post-secondary attainment. If you look at that first table, you can see, Asian students almost 80%, white students 2/3, and then you look down at the bottom and you see Black or African American students 36% of graduation from a 4-year post-secondary institution. On the right-hand side, you look at family income, and you can see at the top, those in the highest quartile of income, over 60% graduate. Down at the bottom, 13% if you're in the lowest quartile. So we have these significant gaps that have been present for decades and decades and decades because the current system actually reinforces that. So that's why we said, look, we have to do something different at the high school level and completely redesign it from the start. And again, we had the luxury of starting over. This was a brand new school. We're just on Monday, we start year number 7. So we can look at it from that way. Next slide, please. Last one here in Indiana specifically, college going rate in 2015, almost 2/3 of graduating seniors went to college. In 2020, it was 53%. And actually, we just got the data from 2021. It's exactly the same, 53%, right? So just more than half of students are going on to college. And I have a whole other deck of slides that talks about why college seems to be important. The fact that 90+% of the jobs that have been created over the last decade have required some type of post-secondary. And so unless your economy wants to depend on just being distribution warehouses, you've got to solve this problem. And that 53% is in total. If you look at specific data for Black and Hispanic students, it's in the 30s and 40s, right? And so again, that sets the table for the problem. Next slide, please. So Purdue Polytechnic High School, you'll see this present in a lot of different schools around the country. We try to do something a little bit unique. Again, we do a personal learning community advisory to start. Every part of instruction we do is based around a project. And so there's almost nothing we do that's just non-contextual instruction where you're just going to math and science and English classes. So industry projects, we use design thinking. It's connection and exposure to experts in the community. And so every project we do has somebody from the community coming in and talking, explaining, helping the students go through it. We do things called immersion projects, which are, again, if you think of a math class or a science class, but it's everything in context. Again, community and business experts coming in. This is where they get their core credits. Indiana has a core 40 diploma, honors diploma. This is where they get those things. But again, everything is done in context. So, for example, like an Algebra 2 class, the last year, the most popular Algebra 2 project was a catapult project where they were building and designing catapults, but they had to use Algebra 2 principles to say, where is that thing going to land? And it turns out sometimes their calculations are off and it lands nowhere close to where they thought it would land. Nobody was harmed in the making of that class. Passion projects, which again are kind of elective credits. Again, everything's happening within this idea of you can do anything you want. So we had kids going on backpacking trips. We had students, we had knitting things. We had clubs that got developed out of all this. And the nice thing about this, like our robotics teams, which by the way are really, really good, that's a passion project. So it happens during the school day. So it's not something they have to do after school, although they do a lot of after school stuff, but you can integrate those things into the school day, derive academic credit for it, and something that students have chosen. And again, what we're trying to do here is help students prepare for when they leave us and we don't have control anymore, because things happen after high school. And whether it's financial issues, relationship issues, we're trying to do things to give them the tools, let them cope with failure. And the last thing I would say on this slide is that when I talk to our graduating seniors, the one thing, and we ask them all the time, like, what's the one thing you took away from this school? And the answer is almost always, we learned how to fail, right? We learned how to deal with that idea that something didn't work the way I thought it. The catapult landed over by the middle school. And I had to revise my calculation. Like, I learned from that, right? And that, when you take that forward into college, when you fail that first test, or you decide that Thirsty Thursday really is Wicked Wednesday, and you discover that's maybe not the way to go. Those are things that we try to instill in our students that they can recover from and adapt to. Next slide, please. And then finally, lesson learned. Like, there's a reason we were talking just before this started, like the vast majority of high schools don't do things like this, and that's because it's really hard. You have to be committed. It is very, very difficult. And the temptation is always to revert back to what's safe, right? So for example, when we say, hey, we want our students to do better on SAT math portion, the temptation is to say, well, then we just need to do math class every day. Like, we're gonna give them traditional math courses. Like, okay, we actually know the data that says if you do traditional math courses, we know who's going to be successful at that and who's not, because we have decades of data that shows that. So yes, we need to make some changes, but we need to move forward and not look backwards. You've got to be able to pare your academic focus down to the essential learning outcomes. Like, standards are all great, but they're not all essential. And we go deeper, we go more important or more intentional on the most important ones. We actually took the top 5 or 6 key learning outcomes for each course, and we designed projects around those. That lets our teachers and our students, as they're designing projects, to really be intentional about what's happening, and for it to be organic and real. Because students know very quickly, and they'll protest very loudly when you start sticking stuff into a project just because you're trying to check a box. And in the assessing student proficiency, you've got to be flexible. Not everything's a written test. It could be a product of performance, defensive learning, mastery. You have to be really flexible around that. And I think it's interesting. We really leave it to our teachers to say, when do you know a student knows it? And the reality is, with a very high level of certainty, they know. And they can actually say, yes, I'm confident this student knows this because of what they've done through the process. So those are lessons we've learned, and we'll talk as we obviously go through the back part of this webinar about what has to happen at a state level to support these kinds of things. So with that, I think I will turn it back over.
Scott, thank you so much for that very exceptional opening overview. And hopefully, if you were paying close attention and looking at the slide, you saw the connections to some of the points I raised. Although I also love the fact student voice is so important in this space, because kids are going to be unvarnished in telling you what's working, what's not working, what's making a difference. And a lot of people think they're after putting in the least amount of effort, and they're really not. They actually, more often than not, exceed and put in more effort than you'd ever think they're ever capable of. So let's pivot now to this exceptional collection of wonderful experts that we have here today. Jim McNeese is, and I always love featuring members of state boards of education. Jim is a longtime member of the Kansas State Board of Education, also has an extensive career as an educator, including as a former high school principal. So exceptionally positioned, and Kansas is doing some wonderful things that can contribute to this space. Kristen Ferris comes from the amazing organization of Education Resource Strategies. They do amazing work on a whole host of areas that ultimately start with the use of resources, hence their name, Resource Strategies. But that means things about how to create exceptional schools that operate at maximum productivity and produce an exceptional result. Monica Martinez is with the Haas Junior Fund. They have been, I think, an essential partner in the work that's been happening at Purdue Polytechnic. Who am I missing? Oh, well, then, of course, Steve Bone is going to be our facilitator. Steve is from the Hoover Institution of Stanford University, a dear friend, amazing person who understands these issues exceptionally well, and he's going to guide us through a learning experience from the expertise that these amazing individuals bring. Steve, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Paulo. I appreciate it. And it's great to be here with all of you. I'm reminded as I was listening to the presentation that in my years before coming to Hoover, I was at CCSSO working with the state chiefs for many years. And one of my pieces of advice to them is get out to a school, get out of your office, get out of the building, go visit some schools. There's really terrific stuff going on in schools. The more time you spend out there, you'll get a good sense of the kinds of innovations that that are out there that you can build on. So this has been great. This is the next best thing, is being able to hear what these schools are doing. So what we want to do is pivot a little bit to, as state policymakers, what are the steps that we could take to facilitate the development and growth of these kinds of models, right? So the side effect of going and visiting schools is you're driving home, you're like, how can I get more of these if I'm a state policymaker? We should have one of these in every town. We should have one of these everywhere. So we want to dig into, how do you replicate these models? How do you build new models that are doing these same things, and really dig into that? And Paolo hit some themes at the top that I think we want to explore. Sort of, what are those conditions for success? What are the elements that need to be in place, both sort of on the ground in districts and then at the state policy level? And sometimes that's more state policy, but a lot of times that's way less state policy and regulation. So we want to talk about that a little bit. How do we do the kind of, or support as state policymakers, the kind of community building that's required to build these kinds of models that are so interactive with their community, with business partners and so forth, and explore that a little bit. And then there's this question of sustainability. Again, we visit and we've all seen models that are doing really great things. And then unfortunately, sometimes the principal leaves, the superintendent leaves, things happen, and the model sort of withers and dies. And it's a real challenge in our world. So I'd love to dig in on that as well. So why don't we dive right in? And Jim, actually, I'm going to go to you first to talk about the Kansas moonshot. So we'll have another model here to look at. So you're a few years into this program, Jim. Can you tell us a little bit about the Kansas moonshot? What have you guys been working on? What have you seen so far? And then kind of, what are the lessons learned from that?
Is that all you want?
That's all.
Oh, God, good deal. And I have 7 minutes?
A little less.
Okay, thank you. Works for me. Well, thank you. It's a real honor to be here today. And so much for the pleasantries. Now down to the work. Back in 2016, 2017, we went out and visited 175 different schools, 72 different districts, and our commissioner, Randy Watson, led this, and he was really the instigator of it. The board, when it was hiring a new commissioner at that time, was really focused on, we need to get somebody who's a change agent. And we got Randy. And one of the first things he did before he got too comfortable in the chair at the board table was he went out and visited districts across the state and asked basically at I don't know, about probably over 100 community meetings, that what is it that that community or those people, whether they be professionals in education or parents or business, what is it you expect, want, or really would like to have your graduates look like? And we got that information, we brought it back, and on your first slide, which we call our college and career competency wheel, that's pretty much what they told us. They wanted kids to be able to be adaptive, to self-regulate, to have integrity, to be curious, to be goal setters, and so on. Really, I didn't put this in a slide, but only about 3% of the people that we talked to placed the highest emphasis on academic skills and competencies. This was a revelation to us. It was a big aha moment, which led us to move forward in a whole different way than we had actually anticipated. Because before that, everything had been on assessments and tests and what classes you took, and that wasn't what they wanted to hear about. So we came up with an initial framework that is the second slide, and that initial framework, focused on elementary, secondary, but then system-wide, and it's pretty self-explanatory. But the big aha moment here that we got was a bigger emphasis on early childhood and kindergarten readiness. Again, that came from the people. That's what they wanted. They also wanted more art and music in the elementary school. That's a little tougher to do, and we're still working on that. But we put a whole new emphasis, created a new department. We looked forward to we hired more people to work with early childhood and basically birth to age 8. And a good start obviously makes sense. The other thing on the secondary level, individual plans of study became a focus point And we require every student in the state of Kansas to have an individual plan of study. And this is not an individual plan of study where they are told what they're going to do or what they are. This is an exploration where it starts in 7th grade, basically, in a formal way, to where they have an individual plan of study and helps them decide in high school what classes they're going to take, what programs they're going to be part of, and hopefully the direction they want to go. Now, obviously, we all work with students, and the plans change, and that's part of it. And we have found that it was more, and this wasn't an intent, but it was more the experience that these students had in exploring careers and options and opportunities, and the methodology of bringing that into a plan that became the real strength of the program. We have students that come back and tell us, I changed my mind, but I used the same strategies that you gave me, the skill sets to do that. And that's something, quite frankly, I wish I was smart enough to say that we wanted to be an outcome, but it's an outcome that has worked very well for us. And kids are using it. And also the whole idea of family being part of it, business and industry and community being a part of it, that played a gigantic role in changing the relationship of the schools to their communities, and change the experiences of students in small towns of 35 kids in a senior class to large schools like I was at, where we had 2,200 kids in school in high school. So this worked across the state and was excellent. But we came into the areas of what were the core principles, but obviously student success and the integration of student and social emotional learning, community partnerships, personalized learning. Everybody can relate to this, but these became part of the common vernacular of how we move forward. And that's what you have to do. You have to change the culture. You're not going to change it by saying you got to change. You have to give them a vision. You have to provide the strength, the supports. And one of the biggest challenges, when you ask me what that is, it's leadership. And it's not that the leaders don't want to do it, but we have just an outrageous number of people that change every year, especially in our small districts. It's very rare that you see a superintendent or principal going to be there for a career, or even 8 or 9, 10 years. So, this has to be embedded into the faculty. And that's what we've focused on, is in the faculty and as the local board and the expectations of what schools are about. We do have workshops, for folks to do this. We have trainings for leadership. We host a state convention for those that want to come and look at redesign. We promote them in our schools. We have all kinds of what I call stickers and honor awards that we give, and it's working. We've seen our test scores go up. We've seen an increase in post-secondary success, and we see a better school culture, because it looks like we're working for the kids more than it did when we were under this prior system. So, I could keep rolling on. But,
no, that's
I hope that made sense. That's more from a state board perspective.
Right.
We have waived and if somebody tells me, like a super board member, when I was opened a school in Wichita called Northeast Magnet, we talked about the things that we're doing. And I had a state board member whose son went to our school, who grabbed me by the arm after a presentation and said, "You can't do that. That's against policy and rules."
Right.
I said,
Right.
"Yeah, we can."
Right. Better to ask forgiveness than permission. That's kind of a good,
exactly.
a good rule to keep in mind.
One thing that I would have wished I'd done is that we spent a lot of time on individual student projects. And these were all year-long projects. We had a big projects fair. It was a big deal. We brought the public in. We had community partners and business. But, if I did it today, I would give them credit. And I'm talking about credit on their transcript, credit in terms of credits for a class. I didn't even know we could do that then. And I think that's big problem that we face is principals, especially when in their training or their experiences, are not alerted to the fact that they can do stuff. We are not bound.
Right.
Most of our seat time issues and our construction are for finances. They're not for education. And we've got to break that mold where seat time is based on, I've got to meet this for, to get my money, my funding,
Right.
and hopefully it's happening in our state. More schools are getting away from the seat time issue to the competency issue. And our board has promoted that as graduation requirements in terms of just operation of your school.
Yeah.
But it is scary to teachers because now they don't have a traditional controlled, voice. And I heard a little while ago that, when you do this, and it happened in the school that I started, when the prime mover leaves, it starts to
Big challenge.
regress back to the norm.
Yeah.
And the school that I started, it was, almost 25 years ago. It's still doing a lot of stuff, but their focus has changed a little, and they're doing a lot of stuff that's more compatible with a comprehensive school than an innovative school.
Right. And it requires some changes at the state level in terms of the messaging to the districts to make sure they understand that there's flexibility there. I think we wrestle with that with the SEAs sometimes because they can be regulatory and it's hard for them to get over that too.
And we have some board members who have trouble with that.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Monica, let me pivot to you. Would love to get your perspective on some of these. We've been talking about ingredients for success here, some of these key elements. Would love to get your sense, particularly as it regards Purdue Polytechnic, sort of what are those key success points, those key ingredients, and anything that resonated from what Jim was describing?
Well, so much to build on with Jim and Scott, what Scott said. And I love, Scott, that you started off with the Committee of 10, right? Because it's a great point. Then you can move on to James Conant. Our high schools were not designed for all kids to go to college. They were designed to have tracking in them. And when you talk about the Committee of 10 and you look at that curriculum that Scott showed, they were designed for the elite of the elite, right? So I think that's the number one issue is what is the purpose of high school and who and what do we want our students to be. So starting off with this portrait of a college or a high school graduate is so important. And but then also building with what Jim was saying around leadership, like that is so important at multiple levels, right? But Scott hired, for an instructional leader, and that is LaToya, and she is a rock star. And she has been there since the beginning and she stays there, right? And as the organization has shifted, LaToya has always said, I'm keeping my hand up for this principal instructional leadership role. She has never wanted to leave from that. And they brought in other leaders through an amazing pipeline. Dr. Kiana Warren was the next leader of the next school, and she was amazing. And she was mentored by LaToya. So can't say enough, right, about leadership. And in California, we really prioritize that as well as the Commission for Teacher Credentialing and our state department, our state board. But leadership was the number one priority. And this is why Scott has been able to step away, because he developed an amazing leadership pipeline. And so now Kiana is the CEO of the 3 Purdue Polytechs, and LaToya is holding down the fort as an instructional leader for that school, but as a role model to all of the other leaders. And then with that, never to undervalue our teachers, right? Purposely the way they recruit the teachers and the way they support the teachers. Paulo, you started talking about time before we started this session with everyone. There is built-in time for these teachers to do nothing but work together. Nothing to work together besides working with students and having time to plan. But they work together. But all those teachers volunteer in, and they know what they're getting into, and they have a little bit of a mini boot camp, don't they? So they get their own acculturation. And so they need to tap out if they don't want to be there, but they understand. And the reason why they have to understand what they're getting to, and it really kind of goes back to this great quote by a principal from a school in my book on deeper learning, was, what if school looked like real life? And Purdue Polytech looks like real life. You'll send some people in, and I'm sure Scott's heard this, and they go, this isn't school. This is chaos. Because you have students in one corner and you have a student upstairs, you have a student with a teacher, you have a student on a computer, you have a student in the hallway on a video, but maybe what are they doing on that video? And you have adults questioning constantly if these students are on task, right? But of course they are. And so it looks like real life, because going back to Jim's point, they're doing projects. They're doing projects all the time.
Mhm.
They have authentic learning experiences, but also what Scott also does, or what Purdue also does, is they've extended the school into the community. The partnerships they have are beyond compare. Not only is their partner with Purdue Polytech itself, and they were first housed on that campus, but they have partners with the industry. The industry provides apprenticeships, internships, mentorships. They have a bunch of people who just volunteer. I'll be a mentor. I'm going to come in once a week and mentor a student. And so these students are not without adults as role models, as near peers who can help them with their identity, help them navigate, help them think about college and what they're going to be. And then with that, in terms of the partnership, again, with Purdue and Mitch leading this, is the dual enrollment. So students aren't going to have culture shock when they go to higher education. They're going to not only have the academic rigor because of what Purdue Polytech does during their freshman, sophomore, and junior year, but because they start experiencing college and they have concurrent enrollment. But again, at the core of this is the authenticity of how students are learning, the deep personalization with regard to how students move on a competency-based method, but the personalization in how much students know, the teachers know the students, and therefore the students are not only getting the academic support, they're getting the social, emotional support. All of this leads to students having a very strong academic mindset. They see who I am, they see where they're going, and guess what? They can be on a path to that. Because if you look at that big wheel that Jim had, one thing that might have been missing from there was agency. Students who do project-based learning and are in the schools that have personalized competency-based learning develop a sense of purposefulness and agency beyond others. They're taking ownership and responsibility for their school. And if you haven't seen Purdue Polytech, or like what Steve said, if you're a state board or state chief, you got to go out to these schools and you got to sit there. And you can't judge, you have to watch, you have to listen, you have to just really embed yourself in it and just absorb it all, because it is truly inspiring to watch students love going to school because it looks so much like life. And so I just, as a background, I got to know Scott because I was at XQ. I'm now at Haas Junior. And then I kept up the relationship with Purdue when I was at Learning Policy Institute with Linda Darling Hammond, since we were always looking at amazing schools. And Scott's school continues to proliferate, and love talking about the stuff when we get to sustaining and scaling, because Purdue has been successful in doing that. But thanks, Steve, for the chance for me just to kind of show what Purdue's done, but what all these good innovative schools do. And like when I saw Purdue Polytech, it just had the same principles of all the schools. I looked at 8 across the United States in a book on deeper learning, and they all share the same characteristics. And going back to, I think it was Jim's point, student voice is at the core, authenticity is at the core, and putting them first is what goes on in these schools.
Great. Thanks, Monica. So, Scott, let me come to you on that theme of what the state role is. That piece of advice for Monica about just be quiet and listen. we could spread that around a lot of state capitals, but Scott, I'd love to get your sense of, like, if you're a state board member watching this, or a state chief, or what are the pieces? What do the states need to do? What can they do to help facilitate the building of the kind of pieces that we've been hearing about?
Great question. There's kind of 2 aspects of this. The first would be, you have to shine a light and be really transparent about what are the outcomes we're getting, right? And so, like in Indiana, we've created a very transparent state dashboard that looks at all aspects and includes what happens after students graduate, right? So it looks at post-secondary completion, not just attainment, but completion. It looks at wage and salary data. So you can see, if you look at a particular school corporation, what are their graduates doing after high school? So you can start to, you put that out there. Now you start to say, look, this is what's actually happening. And so you can break it down by demographic, you can break it down by, community, by individual school. So that you have to do that first, because without that, everyone can just kind of pat themselves on the back and says, it's all great.
Right.
Then you have to start looking at some things we've talked about here, the conditions. So, for example, at our June state board meeting, we approved a greatly reduced set of standards. And so we eliminate about 1/3 of the standards across all grade levels. And then of the ones that are left, only 1/3 of those are considered essential. Right. So if you do the math, you say, look, if there's 100 ELA standards at 4th grade, we took that down to 66. Only 1/3 of those are essential. That's 22. So we went from 100 that everybody was trying to work on down to 22. Now you can really start to focus, right? You enable those schools to start to be able to do something different whether it's projects or, anything you want to do, because you now don't have to focus on. Then you have to make sure everything's aligned. So on our plate is assessments, accountability, graduation requirements, like all of that has to line up. So I think as a state board member or as a state chief, I'd be looking at what conditions get in the way. What have we added and added and added? How can we pare that down so schools everywhere can do the things that, to Jim's point about, kind of what happened at the school he started, everything will revert to the mean if you don't change the underlying conditions. And that's really what we're trying to do in Indiana. And I think that'd be my biggest advice to state boards across the country.
Yeah, that coherence piece, Paolo and I were in a project together back along, really focused on coherence. If there's nothing else, if you just get the trains to kind of line up in the right direction at a state level, that is massive. And I don't know that state legislators or state policymakers fully appreciate sometimes how they're crossing wires on people, maybe unintentionally, but without going back in alignment. So Kristen, let me go to you about kind of what you're seeing in other districts. ERS does a ton of work in districts, and would love to get a sense of, what are you hearing here that resonates in some of the other work you're seeing? What these districts that are trying this, what are they running into in terms of challenges? And again, for state policymakers, are there things that we can do to help facilitate that for districts that are headed down this road?
Yeah, great. So much resonates. And I feel so privileged to get to hear all these stories from you all who are designing high schools in the field. Particularly the last point about coherency is something that we see so often be a major stumbling block when a district is thinking about how do they make high school redesign at scale work. And coherency has a couple of different versions. There's one coherency issue is we layer on this thing, we're going to try a new advisory program, but we don't change the teacher time to give teachers the time to support actually their new to plan for their new responsibilities in advising, or we don't redesign our curriculum in the way that Scott's saying so that kids actually have access to exciting projects that give them exposure to different sorts of things that they could do. And so there's not this great fodder of exploration for that advisory program. Or the other version of coherency is the one we were just talking about. It's we can redesign a high school because that high school can work against the system, and we can put these amazing people in place and kind of protect that high school from some conditions that actually don't serve it very well. But if we don't then clear those enabling conditions, we'll never be able to work at scale. It can never be, it's always going to be sort of a by exception versus a by design to create a high school that works. And so I think the most exciting thing we're seeing in the field is districts that are taking on high school redesign in a way that really deliberately addresses some of that coherency issue by pairing leading edge school redesign support. So let's pick a handful of high schools and give them really incredible support. Let's select them very carefully. Let's select the leaders very carefully. Let's give the leaders some capacity building support that's incredible. Let's give them resources that they might not otherwise have access to, right? And let these schools work at the leading edge of the system so that the system can learn about all the stuff it has to do in order to enable those kinds of changes without all of that extra, right, required, so that we can start to design the system so that it works instead of by exception, by design. And so that means having this really explicit set of enablers for those schools, both at the district level and the state level, who are saying, what can we do? Tell us what to change, and working really hard on those issues. And then the last thing I would say we've seen that's such an important part of the work is an approach to continuous improvement, because the change takes time. And so we have to allow that this isn't going to be a year-long effort. It's going to be we might start with a group of 9th graders, and we're going to redesign their experience a grade at a time until 12th grade. And then at that point, we have the redesigned school. And every year we're sort of asking, what did we do? How did it go? How do we change? How does the system need to change? And so those feedback loops and deliberate attention to those are so important. So those are some of the things we're learning from our district work. I think about in terms of the state's role, you know, education resource strategies. I should note funding. I do think for these schools that are working ahead of the curve, extra funding can be really important and powerful because they are trying to add partnerships, for example, without sort of yet revamping the broader landscape of how teachers spend their time, or we're not able to change the contract or the funding model at the system level to fund the sort of thing that we know kids are ultimately going to need. So funding can be a really important lever to incentivize and just support redesign, I think, especially in the early years. And then the one other thing that I think that sort of picking up from a point someone else made on the call, this idea about helping districts understand the flexibility they have is really essential.
Yeah.
I think it can't be understated how often we're in conversations with a principal or a district leader who's like, we can't do that. And we sort of look into it and we're like, no, actually, we think you can. And so helping people understand the flexibility they have, I think, is a really, really important role.
That's great. The other thing I'm thinking about is the permission giving piece from the state as well. I think there's a lot of districts that have had their hands slapped, right? So they can be anxious about sort of experimenting, right, and trying some new things. We're seeing a lot of interest at Hoover in sort of short cycle pilots. Let's go try something. It's okay to try it with a small group or a school and try some things for a little while and see how to go. I'm keeping an eye on the time here. I'd like to sort of throw this open to the group around, you know, if state boards are meeting next month, like what would you tell them? What's a step that they could take at their next board meeting, like a real concrete kind of thing that they could put in motion coming right up in their next board meeting that would move some of these things forward? So maybe pieces that we haven't mentioned yet. Would love to get some sense. I'll sort of throw it open to the group here. What would be a next step that a board could take?
Yeah, I'd love to go.
Yeah, Monica, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think the first thing is you have to decide what you want to know, what your high school graduates to do. But I'm very jealous of Indiana's dashboard. California has a dashboard, right? And within our school dashboard, we have a college career readiness index that tells us how schools are preparing students. So I think that has to be, of course, very tied again to your graduate profile, right? But the other thing, and what other states have done, particularly Colorado, but New Mexico, is they're redefining graduation requirements. Redefine your graduation requirements, state board. Let's come up to the 21st century here, right? So Colorado is allowing performance-based assessment and capstone projects to be part of their graduation requirements. Internships are part of the graduation requirements. So if you know what you want students to know and do, then let's put together some graduation requirements that are going to help students get there. And then New Mexico is doing similarly, partly because they were sued for the inequity in terms of their education system for, you know, Latinos there in New Mexico. And so they're still waiting, but hoping to get their capstone approved, right? And then we have, you know, New York, the Regents. They have a consortium of 35 schools that have been doing performance assessment now for over 20 years, and they had a Regents waiver. But now the state of New York, besides piloting some assessment programs, they're thinking about using performance-based assessment as part of their outcome. So those two go hand in hand. I think that's super important. And then the last I'll do, partly because I'm at Haas Junior, where we work on college success, is higher education has a huge signaling effect. Our schools are not going to change to performance-based assessment if I want a 4.7 GPA on their transcript. And if I only want an SAT score. The best thing about the pandemic was test optional and having to look deep around beyond the GPA and to ask students, how did you learn? What did you learn? Or give me examples of your work. And there's colleges that are accepting this now. I did a study with Learning Policy Institute, or we did a study at University of Michigan, how they use performance-based assessment. We did a study at the City University of New York, where they had a partnership with the consortium. So if we can get higher education to start signaling, hey, I don't care about your 5.0, 4.7 honors GPA, then our high schools would be willing to change besides what our state boards can mandate.
How many
And
Carnegie units? Yeah, how many Carnegie units have you managed to amass? And moving on to that.
exactly.
What else would we? I'm hearing a lot of alignment with higher ed, alignment of these various systems. Other advice for our state board members.
Well, I think one thing I would add is just set an expectation that the status quo isn't acceptable. Like you literally have to say, like, this is, acknowledge the outcomes you're getting, and then say, we can't, like, in Indiana, we cannot do the things economically that the state wants to do if we continue with the outcomes we're getting. And so the state board has to step in and say, hey, look, that's not okay. And we're gonna basically put out a call of alarm that says we have got to do something. And that means we can't keep tweaking around the edges of this thing. Like, you can't just do longer school days or a double block schedule, right? And that's going to change everything. You've got to fundamentally shift some of these things, and then start the hard work of all the alignment and all the things that you've got to do to enable that.
Yeah. So a bully pulpit.
Yep.
Right. Other advice?
I would say in that
Go ahead.
bully pulpit, is as a state board member, giving them permission and encouraging them to look differently, to think about those things that when they're on Saturday night and they're talking to their friends and, boy, I wish I could do this. Our board and our regulations are not stopping. The thing that's stopping them is them. If you want to do it, do it. If you're waiting for me to pat your back and give you a ha, let's go, you're never going to get done.
Right.
And supporting those and recognizing, celebrating, but also not coming down on people who it doesn't work out.
Right.
Failure is okay. Now, it's not okay for the kids in terms of, we don't want to ruin a generation, but at the same time, the first time you do project-based learning, it's not going to look like the 10th year you did it.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
And that takes some courage. But on the other hand, from a policy point of view, or from a practical point of view, we have such turnover in administration and leadership. It's hard for somebody to come in and buy into what the last superintendent or principal was doing, unless they have really built a solid base within the faculty and the board and the community. They'll tell them, so yeah, it has to be embedded. You got to get that buy-in from students, from the community, from the faculty. The leadership is, you can lead us, but we're telling you what to do.
Right. So there's a permission giving and a celebrating too. You mentioned that, but I want to highlight that too. Like, you got to shine a bright light on these districts that are being bold.
Oh, even in your own communities.
Yes.
Oh my gosh. Yes. And with business
Some air cover.
Heck, I partnered with Boeing, and one of the largest corporations in the United States. And I had them working on us and telling us what to do and celebrating. And they put our evening of excellence together and paid for it. It was having Boeing put their stamp of approval on it was even more significant to other businesses and community leaders. Well, Boeing likes it, I guess we better like it.
Right.
Steve, I think it's also great for boards to look at data. The same kind of data that Scott was looking at. And also, if you look at data on an individual, I think every state might have an innovative high school that they can use an example in their own state, elevate what they're doing and use that as inspiration, because sometimes there are a lot of hidden gems out there that have gotten this, that are doing wonderful things that just aren't on the radar screen. And I think finding those data can help make that happen.
Yeah. Kirsten, I'll give you the last word here.
Yes, that
that
resonates with what I was going to say. Examples. I think people often, don't do because just to take an example of a district we're working with right now, it's like they want to move away from seat time, but it feels really scary.
Yeah.
And to know what the high quality alternatives are to measuring learning by seat time is a really helpful thing to be able to provide. It could look like this, or this. Here are 3 examples of ways to do it. Helps people understand not just what their flexibilities are, but how you can sort of go about working towards those more inspirational designs.
Yeah, and this is we're not talking big dollars here necessarily. When I was at the department in Maine, we got a small grant. We hired a writer to go out, go visit these districts doing these innovative things, write up these case studies, gather some data. We created a little website where we could put this. So, and we kind of created this little network of districts that was working together and giving each other support as well. And again, we didn't have to spin up a big project at the state level. It's a really tiny project, but it allowed us to celebrate what they were doing, to give them some courage, to give them a little air cover for what they were trying to do, and provide them as models for other districts to follow. So it was really a good project. All right, Paolo, I think we're at time, so I'm going to hand it back over to you.
You know, this crowd has been very quiet. I don't see any questions in the Q&A. There hasn't been much traffic in the chat. Thanks for those who have entered some things in the chat, but I think that's a real tribute to the fact that we've been pushing a lot of information in front of people.
A lot.
I think the other thing that's great is there are a lot of great resources. In addition to Monica's book, you've got XQ out there that has a wonderful website full of great resources. You've got SR, the Southern Regional Educational Board, that does their High Schools at Work program. Also a lot of wonderful resources out there. Plenty of books and materials and examples, or the early college movement. People who are doing great work in project-based learning. And even, you know, I always tell people the College Board has a project-based component of their AP computer science class. So don't tell me that we can't assess project-based kind of learning, because a lot of times assessment is the barrier that people put up. So there you have it. Now, one thing you could do if you're state board members, you could call Paulo DeMaria on the phone and say, Paulo, I want you to come with ERS and with Hoover and host a little get-together that we're going to have of some of the key interests. And let's look at some data. Let's hear some examples. And let's start charting a course for our state to do more in this particular area. And I'll promise you on this call that we'll be happy to support that kind of work. With that, I just want to be thankful to all the wonderful panelists. You all have been exemplary. Thank you so much for bringing the expertise to the table. Thank you so much for the great work that you do. The NASB annual conference is in San Diego, October 25th through 28th. We will have a session, at least one session, on high school redesign. And so our registration can be achieved on our website. Hope to see many of you there. With that, thank you all so very much. Keep up the great work you do, and enjoy the rest of your day. Have a great weekend.